belong somewhere, or do you just look like you don't? It's a question that cuts deeper than most would care to admit, a question that quietly decides who is welcomed and who is watched, who gets the smile and who gets the security guard. And sometimes it decides who is thrown out of a place they built with their own hands. On a crisp evening in Beverly Hills, a man in a plain black hoodie stepped into one of the most exclusive luxury boutiques in California. His sneakers were clean but modest, his jeans unbranded, and his presence silent, except for the air around him that changed the moment he crossed the threshold. The lights were warm, golden, diffused over glass shelves that sparkled with watches worth more than most people's rent. Employees in sleek uniforms glided across the floor, attending to wealthy clients with curated smiles and champagne politeness. But when the man in the hoodie entered, something shifted. He didn't know it yet, but his presence was about to disturb a carefully constructed illusion. A system built not just on wealth, but on perception. And perception, in places like this, can be dangerously narrow. His name was Julian Brooks, 38 years old, founder and CEO of the Brooks Veritas luxury brand, a name whispered among stylists in New York, celebrated in design houses in Milan, and displayed with quiet pride in private closets across Hollywood. A self-made titan of luxury fashion, Julian had built his empire from scratch, from selling hand-stitched leather wallets out of a trunk in Atlanta to running flagship stores in the most elite corners of the country. Julian was the American dream, redefined. But that evening, he wasn't greeted as a success. He wasn't even acknowledged. No one looked up. No one offered help. Until one man did, with the kind of smile that doesn't soften but slices. Graham Walker, the store manager, 42, slick suit, sharp jawline, and eyes trained to measure status in seconds, strode forward with a smirk only people in power wear when they think no one is watching. He didn't ask how he could help. He didn't introduce himself. He simply asked, "Are you sure that bag is in your budget?" while glancing not at Julian's face, but at his shoes. What happened next was swift, words laced with assumptions, questions loaded with judgment. Then the final blow. Graham signaled security. Julian, owner of the brand, was escorted out of his own store. No one in that room knew who he was, and no one asked. But the next day, they would find out. And the truth would be more than uncomfortable. It would be transformative. As Julian didn't come back to get revenge, he came back to rebuild. Something far more fragile than reputation. He came back to reclaim a principle. That luxury, when rooted in exclusion, is nothing but another form of quiet violence. Before we dive into the full story, I want to invite you to sit with this moment. Really sit with it. Make yourself comfortable. Grab a drink. Turn off distractions. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story of power, race, and luxury. It's about truth. And the quiet kind of justice that doesn't shout, but changes everything. Julian Brooks stood in his office, 57 stories above the glittering streets of Los Angeles, with his hands tucked into the pockets of a finely tailored suit that whispered power in every stitch. The windows behind him stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a view of the city that once rejected him. From this height, the skyline shimmered, polished and proud, like the legacy he had built, brick by invisible brick. But despite the gold-plated success, something inside him still trembled. The memory of last night clung to him like smoke. A hoodie, a bag, a smirk. He had walked into Brooks Veritas Beverly Hills, the crown jewel of his luxury empire, dressed like any regular man, not as CEO, not as founder, just as Julian. And that night he had been dismissed, reduced to a stereotype, denied dignity inside a space born from his own dreams. Graham Walker, the manager of that very store, had looked him in the eyes and judged him unworthy. Worse, he had dared to erase him. Julian's jaw tensed as he turned from the window. His reflection in the polished glass was familiar, strong, composed, elegant. But the storm behind his eyes told a different story. The office was silent, save for the low hum of the city below. On the walls hung framed magazine covers, feature spreads, and photos from fashion galas where Julian had been honored as a trailblazer. Yet not one of those accolades had shielded him from the silent venom of prejudice. That was the truth. No suit, no success, no amount of Forbes covers could armor him from the unspoken rules that still governed places like the one Graham had curated. Luxury, to Graham Walker, had a face, and that face did not look like Julian's. He sat at his desk, his hands resting on the smooth walnut surface like they were anchoring him. His assistant Jordan had sent him reports that morning. Customer complaints, anonymous employee notes, internal whispers that had grown louder over the past few weeks. Words like hostile, dismissive, biased. But last night wasn't a rumor. It was personal. And now, it was war. Julian leaned back, closing his eyes for a long moment. He wasn't angry because of the insult. He was angry because he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about every single person who had walked into that boutique and felt the cold slap of judgment, who had been told with silence or sarcasm, "You don't belong here." That's what he had built. Brooks Veritas to dismantle. Luxury, yes, but accessible in spirit, not cheapened, not mass-produced, but inclusive in experience. He had spent his life fighting to prove that excellence didn't wear one's face. And yet, last night, his own store had failed that vision. He remembered his father's voice, rough, tired, but always grounded. "Son, success don't buy you freedom, you build it. And you protect it." Julian stood again, walked to the wardrobe built into the wall. Inside were suits from Milan, coats tailored in London, watches gifted by royalty. But tonight, he wasn't wearing any of those. He reached instead for something far simpler. A black hoodie, worn soft at the elbows, a pair of dark jeans, and sneakers that had carried him through the early hustle of street selling and long nights in cargo vans. He tucked his Rolex into the back drawer, replacing it with a generic digital Casio. His entire look was crafted to disappear, to be judged at a glance. Because tonight, he wasn't going in to impress. He was going in to reveal. As he stood before the full-length mirror, pulling the hood over his head, a familiar tightness returned to his chest. The last time he had dressed like this, he was 19 and being followed through a Macy's while trying to buy a gift for his mother. He hadn't even had the money then, just hope, a $50 bill, and a lesson waiting to unfold. This time was different. He owned the store, and the man waiting to dismiss him didn't know that yet. The streets of Beverly Hills sparkled under halogen lights and expensive exhaust fumes. Cars hummed by, their drivers cloaked in entitlement. Julian's sneakers hit the pavement with rhythm, measured, deliberate. His hands were in his pockets, shoulders relaxed, eyes alert. Brooks Vertars glowed on the corner like a promise. Black granite walls, backlit gold lettering, and a massive glass entrance that looked like the gate to another world. From the outside, it was flawless. But Julian now knew the rot that hid beneath. He steps inside. The boutique was a symphony of soft jazz, hushed tones, and polished marble. Displays of crocodile leather, sapphire-studded timepieces, and evening bags lined the room like artifacts in a museum. Customers spoke in murmurs, low, entitled, and the staff floated among them like hosts at a gala. No one looked. Not when he entered. Not when he hovered. Not even when he touched a $6,000 bag. It took less than 2 minutes for Graham Walker to emerge from the back. Tailored, smug, every inch the man who thought he was the brand. Julian saw it all in his eyes. Not curiosity, not hospitality, calculation. "Can I help you?" Graham asked, the words wrapped in polite poison. Julie met his gaze with calm defiance. "Just browsing," he said, letting the bag hang casually in his grip. Graham's lips tightened. "That's quite an expensive item," he said, slow, deliberate. "Are you sure it's in your budget?" The words landed soft, but they cut like a blade. Julian didn't flinch. "I think I can manage," he said, his tone cool. But the moment kept building. Graham leaned in. The mask dropped further. "This isn't the kind of store for people just looking. We cater to clientele who understand quality. We don't waste time on those who," his eyes scanned Julian's hoodie, "aren't serious buyers." Julian smiled. "Just barely. Do you always judge customers by their clothes, or just when they look like me?" And that's what had happened. The crack in Graham's face. The anger. The hand signal to security. The dismissal. The insult. To try the outlet mall. Might be more your style. And then the laughter from the staff. Julian walked out. Not with rage, not with shame, but with purpose. Because tomorrow he would return. And tomorrow, Graham would learn who he had thrown out. Julian Brooks didn't sleep that night. Sleep was a luxury for people who didn't have to carry history in their bodies. While the rest of the city dimmed its lights and folded into silence, Julian sat beneath the muted glow of his office ceiling, shoulders hunched, forearms braced on his desk. Around him, glass and metal whispered of power, but none of it could quiet the storm in his chest. The echo of Graham's voice still rang in his ears, bitter like spoiled wine. "You don't belong here." The words weren't new, but coming from within his own kingdom. They carved deeper. He stared at a photograph on his desk. His parents on the porch of their Georgia home, arms wrapped around each other, tired smiles stretched beneath the southern sun. His mother wore her favorite yellow blouse. His father's hands were work-worn and strong, still wrapped around a hammer even in the picture, as if the world wouldn't let him rest. They had built what they could with what they had, and taught Julian to do the same. But what they couldn't protect him from was the truth. No matter how high you climbed, someone would still try to push you down, just for being you. Julian rose from his chair slowly, as though every bone in his body had inherited the weight of generations. He walked over to the glass window again, not to look out, but to see his reflection. There he was, 40 stories above a city built on image and illusion, a man with everything and still not enough to be seen. Not when dressed the wrong way, not when his skin spoke louder than his resume. With quiet ceremony, he unbuttoned the cuffs of his dress shirt and began to roll them up, one fold, then another. His movements were slow, meditative, like he was preparing for a ritual. And maybe he was, because what came next wasn't just a confrontation. It was an exorcism. He turned toward a shelf, pulling out a worn leather notebook. Inside were scribbles from a younger Julian, business plans, quotes from Malcolm X and Toni Morrison, lists of goals scribbled in blocky handwriting. At the very bottom of one page, nearly faded, were 6 words underlined twice in red ink. "I will not shrink for them." He closed the notebook slowly and placed it back. "And then," he whispered to the empty room, as if addressing every person who had ever looked down on him, "I made this world. You just get to walk through it." The next morning, Julian didn't go to the office. He went to the south side of Los Angeles. He walked the blocks where he once handed out flyers for pop-up sales, where he used to sell leather belts from the back seat of his car, calling out to people on corners, sometimes being ignored, sometimes being mocked, but always believing. The streets were the same. Graffiti, concrete, the whiff of tacos and tire rubber. But Julian wasn't. He walked into a small storefront with no signage, just a bell above the door. The place where he got his first samples made. The woman behind the counter, Miss Edith, 72 now and still sewing, looked up and smiled wide. Well, Lord, look who the wind blew in. Julian chuckled, and they embraced. You still sewing for the angels, Miss Edith? She winked. Only the ones who don't forget where they came from. They sat for a while, and Julian told her everything. About the store, the insult, the dismissal, the betrayal. Miss Edith didn't say much. She didn't need to. After a long pause, she reached across the counter and held his hand. Pain doesn't always speak loud, baby. Sometimes it just stands still and makes people uncomfortable. That night, Julian wrote a memo. It was short, direct, no branding fluff, no performance. It went to every store manager, every regional director. We are not here to be elite. We are here to be exceptional. Exceptional service, exceptional respect, exceptional humanity. If we lose that, we lose everything. And with that, the spark was struck. But fire doesn't roar instantly. It smolders, and it tests. And Julian knew, before he asked anyone else to change, he had to dig deeper into his own scars. So he drove, not to Beverly Hills this time, but to his childhood home in Atlanta. The house was boarded up now. His parents were long gone. But he needed to walk that porch again. He needed to remember why he started. The air was thick with summer and ghosts. He sat on the steps, elbows on knees, staring at the cracked sidewalk where he once scraped both palms trying to learn how to ride a bike. His dad had told him, "Son, you fall, but you stand. That's the rule." Julian nodded to himself, then stood. He returned to L.A. 2 days later, walked back into headquarters wearing all black, no logo, no flash, just clarity. And as he passed his assistant, Jordan, in the hall, she raised an eyebrow. "You look like a man on a mission." Julian didn't stop walking. "I'm done asking for permission to be whole." Later that evening, he sat in the boardroom, a bit alone at first. Then, one by one, his executive team filed in. Some were black, some Latino, some white, some queer, some straight. All hand-picked, all trusted. All tired in ways that only silent injustice can make a person tired. Julian didn't raise his voice. And he didn't have to. What happened to this wolf? He told them the story, everything. And when he finished, no one said a word. Just stillness. Until Marcus, his VP of retail, leaned forward. "They think we're past this, but we're not." Julian met his eyes. "So let's stop pretending." That night, the directive was clear. Change the culture. From the inside out. Not just in training, not just in policy, in practice. Julian returned home near midnight. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, washing his face. His reflection met him with a new kind of honesty. There were fine lines near his eyes now. He was aging. But beneath the surface, he was becoming something sharper. Not just a leader, not just a founder. He dried his face slowly, looked himself in the eye. "You've come too far to bow now." Julian Brooks didn't knock. He didn't announce. He didn't send an assistant a warning email or a heads-up memo. He simply arrived. At exactly 3:03 p.m., under the fierce glow of the California sun, Julian stepped out of a sleek, matte black town car and adjusted the cuff of his Navy meal suit with the kind of precision that didn't ask for respect. It commanded it. His steps were quiet but heavy with purpose, the soles of his polished shoes hitting the marble entrance of Brooks Veritas, Beverly Hills, like a quiet drumbeat before war. The very store that had expelled him like an unwanted intruder was about to meet the man behind the mask it once ignored. This time, there was no hoodie, no disguise, no humility demanded by circumstance. Julian Brooks walked in as himself, and the silence that followed was deafening. Inside, the boutique shimmered like a luxury cathedral. Everything was in its place. Gleaming display cases, strategic lighting that flattered every angle, music humming low like a secret only wealth could afford. But something was different today. There was tension in the air, a buzz of nerves beneath the polish. This because word had spread. The CEO was coming. Julian took his time at the door, letting his eyes sweep across the room. Customers turned to glance, some curious, others sensing a shift they couldn't quite name. Employees froze mid-conversation. Those who had ignored him just nights before now stood straighter, fixed their collars, smoothed their expressions. But the moment that mattered most came from the back of the store. He emerged from the glass-walled office like a man stepping onto a stage. Confident, practiced, gleaming in his suit. But the moment he saw Julian, that confidence cracked. It wasn't subtle, just a flicker in the eyes, a tightening of the jaw. But Julian saw it all. Recognition. Regret. Graham didn't know where to look. For a split second, his gaze dropped to Julian's shoes, the same way he had once scanned for signs of wealth. But now, those details didn't matter. Now he was staring at the very man he tried to erase. And the silence between them, it was a verdict. Julian didn't offer a smile. He didn't return the fake gestures of welcome. Instead, he moved forward slowly, deliberately, like a storm pulling in over still waters. The two men stood face to face. Close. No podium, no hierarchy, just truth in raw daylight. Graham opened his mouth first, reaching out with a hand polished for handshakes and press photos. "Mr. Brooks." Julian's voice cut through the space like tempered steel. "You didn't see me that night, but now you can't look away." Around them, the boutique had gone still. One of the newer associates stepped back into the shadows, unsure whether to intervene or witness. An older woman near the jewelry case held her breath. A whisper fluttered across the room, like a breeze through broken glass. Julian continued, his voice even but charged. "I built this place so that no one would ever feel like they didn't belong here. But you turned it into a gate. You guarded it like it was yours to protect, as if the fabric on someone's back tells you what's in their soul." Prim's hand dropped slowly. His face turned pale. Julian stepped around him, wordless, forceful, every step a reclamation. He made his way through the store, past cases he had once personally approved, past walls he had painted with his vision. The place he had dreamed into existence was still beautiful, but now it bore scars. He stopped in front of the same display where he had been humiliated days before. A $6,000 0-cent leather bag sat pristine beneath the glass. Julian reached down, opened the case without asking, and lifted the bag with care. The room watched as he ran his hand along the stitching, the curve of the handles, the quiet power of craftsmanship. Then he turned, holding the bag in the light. And he spoke loud enough for every soul to hear. This isn't what makes someone worthy. He lowered the bag gently back into the case, then turned to face Graham once more. But how we treat people, that's everything. For a heartbeat, no one moved. And then Julian walked toward the front entrance. But this time, not to leave in shame. He stopped near the doorway, turned back, and looked Graham dead in the eye. You still have a job, Julian said. But now you have a purpose. And if you ever forget what it is again. He leaned in slightly, his voice lower, heavier, final. You'll be walking out that door before I do. A breath, a pause, and then Julian turned once more and walked into the light outside, shoulders straight, suit crisp, soul unburdened. Behind him, no one laughed. No one whispered. They just watched. Because when the king returns, not with vengeance, but with truth, the whole kingdom remembers. Julian Brooks didn't celebrate. He didn't call a meeting to pat himself on the back or post a triumphant photo on social media with some pithy quote about leadership and justice. That's not who he was. And this moment, this reckoning, wasn't about performance. It was about truth. Because what happened in that Beverly Hills store wasn't just a failure of one man, named Graham Walker. It was a system breathing through polished marble and luxury glass. Now, the system would burn. The day after his return to the store, Julian stood at the window of his top-floor office, shirt sleeves rolled up, tie gone, face lit by the early sun breaking through the Los Angeles skyline. Below, the city pulsed. He turned toward his team. They were already seated. Jordan, his ever-sharp assistant, Marcus from retail, Lena from marketing, and 6 others, all hand-picked, all now watching him like he was a storm they'd never quite seen roll in like this before. On the long walnut table in front of them lay 3 stacks of paper, customer complaints, internal evaluations, and anonymous employee reports, spanning 6 months across every Brooks Veritas store in the country. Julian didn't say. He walked the perimeter of the room slowly, hands behind his back like a general surveying his troops. His voice, when it came, was steady, but not soft. Yesterday, he said, I didn't fire Graham Walker. Everyone tensed slightly. He stopped walking. I could have, and maybe I should have. But I didn't come this far to just cut off heads. I came to expose the rot. He looked at the papers on the table, reached forward, and with one clean, deliberate motion, set fire to the top sheet. Gasps echoed as flame devoured the page, curling the corners, turning words into ash. Jordan jumped to her feet with a metal tray, catching it just in time before the fire spread. Julian stood still as the smoke twisted toward the ceiling. It wasn't the fire they feared. That was the message. We're not covering anything up anymore, Julian said, his voice low and certain. What happened in Beverly Hills, isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom, a culture that we let exist, one that speaks luxury but whispers exclusion. And I'm done whispering. And walked to the head of the table and finally sat down. This isn't about Graham anymore, it's about us. Jordan leaned forward, her voice careful. So what do we do? Julian looked around the room and answered without hesitation. We burn it down. Then we rebuild it right. Within 24 hours, an internal memo was issued to every Brooks Veritas location across the country. No branding, no gold font, just black words on white paper. Effective immediately. All employees, from entry-level associates to executive directors, will undergo mandatory inclusion training. This training will not be outsourced. It will not be theoretical. It will be human, led by real people, real stories, real consequences. Failure to participate fully and honestly will result in termination. No exceptions. The future of Brooks Veritas begins now. Julian didn't stop at policy. He started showing up, not in boardrooms, in stores. He arrived unannounced in Chicago, walked the floor with sales associates in Miami, stood behind the register in Dallas, and listened quietly in New York. Not as CEO, but as a witness. And what he saw was painful. In some stores, excellence, kindness, integrity. But in others, cold glances, selective hospitality, quiet layers of privilege that moved through the air like perfume. Julian didn't speak much on those visits. He took notes. And when he returned to headquarters, he called a meeting, not just with leadership, but with the ones who had been silent for too long. Regional managers, store veterans, corporate lifers. He stood before them, holding a stack of emails from customers who had been ignored, insulted, overlooked, and he read them, for voices one by one. Out loud. The room was dead quiet, until Julian closed the final letter, placed it on the table, and said, "This is the cost of silence." He hired speakers, not consultants, but survivors, men and women who had been followed in stores, dismissed at counters, labeled suspicious because of a hoodie or an accent or the shade of their skin. They didn't show PowerPoints. They told stories. And when they were done, Julian would walk to the front and say only this: "If you don't feel uncomfortable, you're not paying attention." Meanwhile, Graham Walker's world had changed. He had been fired, but he had been reassigned. For 30 days, he was not allowed behind a desk or in the back office. His new role, greeter, positioned at the front of the Beverly Hills store, required to welcome every customer who entered, by name if possible, with warmth always. At first, Graham wore the mask well. Smile, nod, open the door. But the change came slowly, day by day, customer by customer. He began to see things he'd never let himself see before. The nervousness in a black teen's eyes when she stepped into the boutique. The hesitation of a Latinx father, unsure if he could afford even browsing. The quick glances exchanged by white customers when someone who looked different walked in. And something shifted. One morning, a young woman in scrubs, clearly just off a long hospital shift, entered the store, hesitant. She didn't look like she belonged by old standards. But Graham stepped forward and said gently, "Good afternoon. Welcome. You work in healthcare?" She blinked, surprised. "So how'd you know?" He smiled, not the corporate smile, a real one. "Dave, because I see you, and I'm glad you're here." She smiled back, teary-eyed. Then for the first time in years, Graham Walker didn't feel like he was losing power. He felt like he was becoming human. Julian kept moving. Store after store, policy after policy, action after action. But the moment that stayed with him came weeks later when he returned, quietly, to the Beverly Hills boutique. No press, no team. Just him. He wore a simple black sweater, clean dark jeans, leather sneakers, casual, comfortable, still unmistakably him. When he walked through the doors, the staff didn't stiffen. No one paused. No one whispered. Instead, a new hire, young, nervous, bright-eyed, stepped forward with a calm smile. "Welcome to Brooks Veritas," she said. "Can I help you find anything today?" Julian looked at her, looked at the space around him. The energy had changed. He nodded. Not today, he said, just browsing. And for the first time, he meant it. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Julian Brooks walked once again into the Beverly Hills boutique. No security detail, no entourage, no announcement. The sun outside had begun to dip, casting long amber shadows through the glass facade of Brooks Veritas. Inside, the lighting was warm and soft, catching the gold trim on the displays, making the marble floors shimmer like water beneath moonlight. Julian wore a simple black sweater, tailored slacks, clean sneakers. He didn't come to inspect. He didn't come to test. He came to see, for himself, what remained. He took a few steps inside and stood still, letting the space breathe around him. It was quiet, but it wasn't cold. A young associate noticed him first and smiled, a natural one. "Welcome back, sir." Julian nodded politely. "Just browsing." The associate stepped aside, respectful, no pressure. Julian walked slowly through the store, stopping once to admire a new display of hand-stitched leather satchels. He let his fingers brush the grain. They had the same pattern he'd once sold from the trunk of his car in Atlanta. Same dream. Different world. And then he saw him. I'm a boy, standing by the watch display. Not polished like before, still dressed well, but something in his posture had changed. No arrogance, no sharpness. His hands were folded loosely in front of him, eyes focused, head bowed slightly as he explained the mechanics of a timepiece to a customer. A black man in his 50s who listened intently. Julian didn't interrupt. He watched. Graham answered questions patiently, pointing out craftsmanship, movement, details. The customer nodded, clearly engaged. There was no trace of salesmanship, only service. When the man stepped away to continue browsing, Julian moved closer. Crail turned, and their eyes met. For a split second, neither of them spoke. Then Graham stepped forward, not hurriedly, not nervously, but with quiet purpose. He stopped a few feet away and clasped his hands together. "Mr. Brooks." His voice was lower than Julian remembered, less crisp, more human. "I didn't know if I'd get the chance to say this, but I want to." Julian waited. Graham's eyes dropped for a breath, then met his gaze again. There's a layer. The words landed without flair, without excuse. And in that moment, Julian saw something unexpected. Not game, not performance, but understanding. Real, bone-deep understanding. Raven continued, quieter now. "Yeah. I used to think luxury meant control, curating, protecting the space, but really, I was just protecting myself. From discomfort, from change, from seeing what I didn't want to see." Julian remained silent, letting the words find weight. Graham inhaled. "I didn't get it before. Not really. But I do now. Because once you see it, the glances, the tension, the way people shrink when they think they don't belong, you can't unsee it." The pause. Julian didn't respond with a lecture. He didn't need to. Instead, he took one slow step forward and did something unexpected. He placed a hand on the glass of the display next to them. Just a gentle tap. Barely a sound. But Graham understood, because that was the same glass Julian had stood behind the night he'd been dismissed. He was showing Graham what he hadn't seen then, what he now could never forget. Julian finally spoke, his voice even but touched with something deeper. "We don't grow by building higher walls. We grow by breaking better mirrors." Graham nodded slowly. His shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but in release. "Thank you," he whispered. Julian didn't say, "You're forgiven," because this wasn't about absolution. It was about awareness. So he simply looked at Graham and said, "Keep seeing." And he turned. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, just with clarity. As he reached the door, the young associate from earlier called out, "Have a great evening, Mr. Brooks." Julian smiled. "You too," and walked out into the quiet dusk of Beverly Hills, where the shadows were long, but finally, so was the light. Julian Brooks drove back from Beverly Hills in silence. No music, no phone calls, just the low hum of tires on asphalt and the echo of words that still lingered in the back of his mind. Keep sailing. Not a command, not even a challenge. Just the truth. It had been weeks since the first confrontation, weeks since that moment of rupture when Graham Walker had tried to dismiss him as another man in a hoodie. Since then, systems had shifted, people had been shaken, and policies had been rewritten. But Julian knew, true change doesn't end with an apology. It begins when the standard is no longer comfort, but fire. He pulled into the garage of Brooks Veritas headquarters just as the city lights began to flicker on like stars over steel. The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent, except for the soft, low, mechanical hum. Julian stood motionless, his reflection doubling in the chrome of the doors, dressed once again in black. This time not in mourning, but in resolve. Waiting at his office was Jordan, clipboard in hand, her expression unreadable. Chicago reported a 16% increase in customer retention since the training started, she said as they walked. Miami has requested to expand inclusion sessions to part-time staff, and we've had over 24 personal testimonials from customers saying they felt finally seen. Julian nodded once, quiet pride. But pride wasn't the fuel. He stepped into the boardroom and found his core team already there. This time, the walls were lined with not just charts and quarterly projections, but photographs. Photographs of customers, of families, of workers, of young people of color shopping for prom suits, of older immigrant women smiling next to luxury bags they never thought they'd touch. The real face of Brooks Veritas. Julian stood at the head of the table, laid his hand flat on the wood, and said, simply, "We're not done." What followed wasn't a campaign. It was a reformation. Julian didn't just want to change his stores. He wanted to change the industry. He gathered a task force of experts, scholars in race and consumer behavior, fashion historians, frontline employees, and former customers who had experienced exclusion firsthand. Not to talk, to build. A new standard. The Brooks Veritas Manifesto, they called it, wasn't about vision statements or vague promises. It was 5 pages of non-negotiables, staff behavior protocols, representation in advertising, theater store layout and accessibility guidelines, community investment quotas, and, most of all, accountability. Any store, any manager, any executive failing to meet them would be replaced. No exceptions. To launch it, Julian chose not a press release, but a funeral. Yes, a funeral. A symbolic one. In the courtyard of HQ, Julian stood in front of a glass casket containing the original Brooks Veritas mission statement, framed, gold-trimmed, poetic. He didn't read it aloud. He shouted it with a steel hammer in front of his entire staff. Shards flew in every direction. Silence followed. Julian turned to the crowd, his voice steady. That was built for a world we no longer serve. It was elegant, but it's blind. So today, we bury it. A long white cloth was laid across the broken frame. Employees stepped forward and wrote, not slogans, but stories, moments of exclusion, of being dismissed, of being doubted, and then moments of being welcomed, of being recognized, of being seen, became a living tapestry. And when it was full, Julian stood beside it, hands clasped in front of him. "No brand is truly luxurious," he said, "until the people who wear it feel human in it." Soon, fashion editors were calling, then industry leaders, then rival CEOs. "What are you doing?" they asked. And Julian answered simply, "What we should have been doing all along." He didn't want to dominate the industry. He wanted to dismantle what was toxic within it and rebuild it better. He opened a grant for young designers from underrepresented communities. He started a mentorship program pairing marginalized talent with luxury veterans. He launched an internal podcast called The Dressing Room, where employees anonymously shared stories of what it felt like to exist inside the system. And then, one day, he received a letter. It came in a white envelope, no return address. Inside was a single photo. A little black boy, maybe 7, standing in front of a Brooks Veritas window, pointing at a mannequin in a perfectly tailored suit. And on the back of a photo, written in careful handwriting, he asked me if he could wear something like that one day. And I gotta say, yeah, they made that suit for you. Julian closed his eyes and let the moment land, not on his shoulders, but in his soul. Later that night, Julian walked the halls of headquarters alone. He stopped at the wall of past awards. Best luxury brand, fastest growing retailer, most innovative marketing. And he stared at the plaques. The butcher then reached out, Utah, and took them all down, and by one. Carefully, deliberately. He didn't smash them. He didn't throw them away. He simply set them aside, because they had honored what he used to value, and what came next would require new measures, new mirrors, new fire. Julian Brooks stood under the stage lights, not behind a podium, but in the center of a circular space, surrounded on all sides by the people who had been part of the journey. Store managers, sales associates, executives, customers, designers, critics, skeptics, survivors. All of them had received the same simple invitation. You are not just a witness to change. You are part of it. The room was not a typical conference hall. It was stripped bare. Black floors. No stage, no elevation, no hierarchy. The walls were hung with portraits. Real faces, real stories. Each one paired with a single quote, handwritten underneath in gold ink. One read, "I used to stand outside this store, afraid to enter. Now, I'm the one holding the door." Another, "Luxury should never feel like a test." At the center, under a soft circle of light, stood Julian. In his hand, he held a key. Not symbolic. Real, heavy, solid brass. The kind once used to lock the original store when he still worked alone, running late nights from warehouse to customer homes, his dreams stitched between deliveries. He raised it slowly. "This key opened my first boutique," Julian said, his voice quiet. But it carried. "I kept it not because it opens a door." He paused, looking around the room. But because it reminds me who that door was made for." He held it out in his palm, open for all to see. "Back then I thought I was building a store. But what I really wanted was a room. A room where nobody had to pretend. Where nobody's value was judged by silence. A room where stories walk in, wearing sneakers, hoodies, scrubs, and still get a smile." He took a step forward. and dropped the key, not gently, onto a block of concrete that stood beside him. The metal clanged loud against the hard surface. That sound echoed through the room. It was ceremonial and a declaration. "This doesn't belong to just me anymore," Julian said. "It belongs to every person who ever felt locked out of something they deserved to be part of." From there, the event unfolded like no corporate launch anyone had seen. There were no product displays, no champagne, no velvet rope. Instead, one by one, people came forward to tell their truth. A man from Detroit, now a Brooks Veritas regional lead, spoke about the first time he walked into a luxury store and was followed from aisle to aisle until he left in shame. An older Korean woman, who'd worked behind the scenes in fashion for 30 years, talked about never once being invited to sit in front row, even though the runway ran on her hands. A queer black stylist cried as he said, "I used to hide in high fashion. Now I own my space in it." Every voice made the room wider, deeper. Then Julian stepped forward once more. On a table in front of him were 5 white shopping bags. He opened each one and pulled out items that had shaped his journey. A scuffed wallet he used to sell on the streets. A photo of his parents in front of their Atlanta porch. The first rejection letter from a landlord. The hoodie he wore the night Graham dismissed him. And finally, a mirror, cracked, not broken. He held it up. "This," he said, "was the last thing I looked into the night before I almost quit." He turned the mirror toward the room. You don't have to be whole to reflect something true. A silence fell, in soft applause, then tears, then connection. Outside the event space, a line was forming. Customers, strangers, designers, parents, students, all waiting to walk through. But the door didn't say VIP entrance. It said, "Welcome home." And beside it stood a placard. "There, this space is for you. For your scars, for your triumphs, for your stories." Because luxury doesn't live behind walls. It lives between us. That night, as Julian helped sweep the floor after the last guest had gone, Jordan walked up, holding the brass key he had dropped. "You really just gave it up?" she asked. Julian looked at her, smiled. "I didn't give it up," he said. "I gave it forward the next morning." Long after the event had ended, and the lights had dimmed, Julian Brooks walked alone through the now quiet courtyard of Brooks Veritas headquarters. The space was still, but it wasn't empty. The concrete block where he had dropped the brass key remained in place, untouched. The cloth of handwritten stories still rippled gently in the breeze. Nearby, someone had left a single white rose. No note, no signature, just a gesture, silent and sacred. Julian crouched down, brushing his hand lightly over the names and sentences inked into the fabric. The stories were smudged in places, blurred by fingertips, tears, or time. But they were still there, still breathing. Charlotte still waiting to be read? He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. This wasn't a victory lap. It wasn't a conclusion. It was a beginning, one that demanded something from everyone who had watched, listened, nodded in agreement. Because what's the point of hearing truth if we don't hold it? Back inside, the team was gathering. Jordan stood by the glass wall, scrolling through feedback pouring in from across the world. Thousands of messages, some from strangers, some from designers, some from kids. A 14-year-old wrote, "This story made me believe that one day, someone like me could own something beautiful." And Holy man, I thought it was too late to change. Now I know it's never too late to listen. Julian didn't reply to any of them. Not yet. Instead, he picked up a piece of charcoal from the art station someone had set up for guests the night before. He walked to the white wall in the hallway, the one that used to display marketing awards, and, in a space completely blank now, he raised the charcoal and wrote, in bold strokes, "We don't fix the world by fighting what it was. We fix it by building what it should have been all along." He stepped back, looked at it, then underlined it twice. Jordan walked up beside him. "That's going to get shared everywhere," she said. Julian shook his head slowly, eyes still on the wall. "I don't care if it gets shared, I care if it gets lived." Later that day, he visited the Beverly Hills boutique one last time, not for business, not for closure, just to feel the space as it now was. Entered, no one stiffened, no one stared. A young black girl, probably in her early 20s, greeted him with a confident smile. "Welcome to Brooks Veritas. What brings you in today?" Julian looked around, eyes softening. "And that's what we want. A long road," he said quietly, "and a lot of stories." She tilted her head, curious but not intrusive. "Well, I hope today becomes one of the good ones." Julian smiled. "It already is." He walked to the far end of the store, past the mirror where his reflection had once been denied, now cleaned, polished, and moved to face the entrance. On its frame, someone had etched a new phrase in brass. "You belong here." Julian stood there for a moment, looking at himself, no longer checking for flaws, just recognizing the truth. And then came the final act. A boy, no older than 10, stood outside, peeking in through the front glass. Julian noticed him, crouched down to eye level, and gently waved him in. The boy stepped inside wide-eyed, holding the hand of his older brother. Julian knelt. "What do you see?" he asked the boy softly. The boy looked up at the shelves, the displays, the art, and then, without hesitation, he pointed to the mirror and said, "I see me." Julian felt his throat tighten. He placed the hand over his heart and whispered, "And we've done something right." Outside, the wind picked up. The stories on "The Cloth in the Courtyard" danced in the air like sails on a ship, heading somewhere better. And in that moment, Julian knew this wasn't his legacy. It was theirs, only theirs, and ended the way truth often does, not with applause, but with stillness. That evening, Julian Brooks returned home and sat on the porch where his mother once rocked him to sleep. No cameras, no speeches, just the soft rustle of Georgia wind through oak trees and the rhythm of his own breath settling back into his body. In that quiet, healing was happening, not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that allows it to rest. What follows next won't be loud either. Justice, when built properly, is steady. Restoration, when honest, is slow. But the echoes of what happened, what was faced, named and changed, will never fade. The mirror Julian once stood in front of now reflects thousands. And every person who steps into that reflection carries forward a piece of what was reclaimed. The message we leave you with is simple. We do not choose the history we inherit, but we do choose the future we build. Racism is not always screamed. Sometimes it's shrugged. Sometimes it's silence in a room. A look, a doubt, a door that never quite opens. But we have the power, through courage, through action, through story, to name it, to unlearn it, to refuse to pass it forward. As we grow older, perhaps the greatest strength we hold is not in changing the world overnight, but in changing what's right in front of us. The way we treat a stranger, the way we speak up, even when our voice shakes, the way we see, not what someone wears, but who they are. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, breathe deeper, or remember something long buried, we invite you to help carry it forward. Please consider subscribing to Racist Stories Uncovered, sharing this story with someone who needs to hear it, and joining us as we continue to build a world where truth is told and dignity belongs to all. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story. With respect, the team at Racist Stories Uncovered. Real stories, raw truths, justice revealed.